Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to welcome you to a panel that marks the 20-year anniversary of a groundbreaking documentary, Trembling Before God. The panel grew out of conversations I've had over a number of years with one of our panelists, Dr. Tanya Zion-Waldoks, about the legacies of this film vis-a-vis Orthodox LGBT activism in Israel. Before we start, I want you to be aware that this webinar will be recorded, and in the event that you have to log out early or you would like to share the recording with someone, you will be able to do so. Also, please be aware that the chat function has been disabled, but if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible in the latter part of the program. The panel is supported by Fordham Center in Jewish Studies and a generous grant from the Carpenter Foundation. I hope that you've had a chance to perhaps watch the entire documentary in the past, or if not, some of the snippets we sent around in the days leading up to this panel. Trembling Before God is a groundbreaking documentary that broke the taboo and silence surrounding homosexuality in Orthodox Jewish communities. It presented the stories of Orthodox LGBTQ individuals in the US, Israel, and England. And in fact, it was one of the first public documents to capture the lives of religious LGBT persons in any religious tradition. Beyond exposing such stories on screen, the film evoked debates about in varied Jewish communities and was followed. The film evoked debates in various communities about what it was like to live as an Orthodox LGBTQ person, and it was followed by educational campaigns aimed at rabbis, parents, therapists, and educators around the world. And our panelists today played various roles in the production and rollout of the film, and were invited to reflect upon the film's legacies and how it shaped Orthodox LGBT activism in the decades that followed. I would like to introduce our panelists now and then proceed with our conversation. First to speak will be Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who is an Orthodox ordained educator, writer, and speaker who has led the call for LGBTQ inclusion in the Orthodox world. He's the author of the award-winning book, Wrestling Before God and Men, Homosexuality in the Jewish Tradition from University of Wisconsin Press. Rabbi Greenberg is a founder of the Jerusalem Open House, Jerusalem's first gay and lesbian community center, and he is faculty member at the Hartman Institute of North America. Rabbi Greenberg is also the founding director of Eshel, an Orthodox LGBT community support, education, and advocacy organization, and lives with his partner, Stephen Goldstein, and daughter, Amalia, in Boston. Rabbi Greenberg was one of the individuals featured in Trembling. Avigal Sperber is a documentary filmmaker and social activist in Israel. She's the founder of two key Orthodox LGBT organizations in Israel, Bat Kol, an organization for religious lesbians, and Shoval, an outreach organization that works to educate Orthodox communities about LGBT lives. In the past 25 years, Abigail has worked on dozens of films for which she has won multiple awards in Israel and abroad. Her most acclaimed works include the award-winning film Probation Time and the documentary The Hangman. Dr. Tanya Zion-Waldoks is a professor at Hebrew University in Israel. She's a gender scholar, feminist activist, and mother of four. Tanya's work is at the intersection of religion, gender, and politics, and she has a long list of publications. Her current work explores the links between Jewish and Muslim feminisms in Israel, Palestine, anti-racist activism led by Jewish women of Ethiopian descent fighting police brutality, and the emergent Haredi feminist movement. Outside academia, Tanya is involved with a variety of innovative Jewish initiatives. Tanya was involved in the educational campaign that accompanied Trembling's rollout in Israel. My first set of questions to the panelists, and we will go one by one, is about the film's production, rollout, and reception. And I want us to think about the film's legacy a little later, where I'll also ask the panelists to engage each other. So the first question goes to Stephen. I'm going to ask you to keep to about 10 minutes each, so we have time for more conversation and audience questions later. So Steve, could you tell us briefly how you became involved in the project? In our communication prior to the panel, you wrote that you spent a year and a half carrying the film around the world. So what was the experience of participating in this project like? How would you characterize the film's role in launching and advancing the movement in Israel and the US, and of course, your own activism?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope all of us can, can make the memories of 20 years ago sharp and scintillating. The truth is that there's not much that I would say is true about the Orthodox LGBTQ world today that didn't find its roots in those moments in Jerusalem and all over the US and ultimately all over the world, as over 500 I attended 500 post-screening dialogues all over North America, South America, Europe, and places in Asia. And so to begin, I'm just going to say that, this story begins with a very young, energetic, mercurial man named Sandy Dabowski, who ended up knocking on my door in Jerusalem. So I was in Jerusalem at a particular moment in my life. I was a rabbi teaching at the National Jewish Center for Learning and Leadership, but I was struggling myself with my own sexuality, and at a point of breaking in which I did not know quite how to move forward, I ended up getting a 2-year stint in Yerushalayim at the Mandel Institute. And it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of think outside the box. And I, for the first time in my life, not quite out, but I connected with the queer community in Yerushalayim. And there was known that there was this rabbi in Jerusalem who had come, and he knocked on my door and said, "Listen, I'm making a film about Orthodox gay Jews." And I laughed and I said, "That's great." And then he began to describe it to me, and I thought he was totally out of his mind. I said, A, you're not Orthodox. B, no one will come to see this film. C, no one's going to actually fund the film. And D, like, who will care about it? And so I said to him, look, no, I'm not interested in being part of it, but I'm happy to hear how it goes along. So every month or so, he would knock on my door and say, listen, I have more footage to show you. And of course, by the end of a year or so, I was totally, enchanted by the project and by Sandy. And eventually I agreed to be interviewed. I did not agree to be in the film till quite the end. And then at some juncture, I would say that it was Sandy's role was key, because I had started engaging in this question. And so I decided to introduce a bunch of young queer Jews in Jerusalem to kind of thinking about this. So I and Amichai Lavi, who's another interesting character in this narrative, began Moach Gavra, which was a gay men's study group in Jerusalem in the beginning, in the end of the 90s. And through that, I began to write and think, and it led me to the first few chapters of a book that finally was finished in 2004, Wrestling with God and Men. So I guess what I would say, just to finish my couple of minutes here, is that the film, it's not to be taken simply, the film intended not to answer any questions. It's extremely important to get that there was a frustrating nature of this entire endeavor, is that had Sandy attempted to answer the questions he was asking, the film would have failed to actually do its work. What it needed to do was tell stories that evoked emotional engagement, reaction, and awareness, and allowed the viewer to begin to ask those questions themselves. And so I think that was probably the most profound thing. Of course, it led to the first time Orthodox Jews, because no answers were given, were able to watch a story that was totally alien to them and begin to think about it. It was the first representation of who we were, and in the way, the beginning of our history.
Wow, that's a bold that's a bold statement there about it. Can you tell us a little bit about the rollout of the film, of what it was like, doing all of these 500 or so presentations about it?
I can. I can tell you that the organizing effort was really challenging. We ended up turning theaters into batei midrash, into houses of study. We were able to go into communities and say, who will sit on a panel? And we constructed panels that were unique to the community who was willing to speak in that space. Those of us who were in the film and who were traveling with Sandy could speak as well. And we discovered allies that we had never met before. We also, encountered very difficult resistance. In one city, they literally shut us down in Mexico City. And just a week before it, we had already our tickets there. We were already planned to go, and they shut us down and said basically they succeeded in boycotting the thing. And the entire film was then screened inside a Jewish bookstore. Actually, no, it was a bookstore on sexuality owned by a wonderful Jewish activist and sexologist. And for a week, that film played on every floor of the bookstore for a few hours every evening, with English translation happening simultaneously. Or in South Africa, when the JCC was going to show the film and then rabbis canceled it. And then a member of the judiciary who was Jewish threatened to sue them because they were violating South Africa's newly framed law that demanded human rights that included rights for sexual expression. And he threatened to personally sue them. And so he forced the issue. And in a number of circumstances, we were boycotted. We were going to go to a school one day and show the film to teachers. And we ended up having to show the film at a restaurant where the teachers who wanted to go could come. We koshered a restaurant in East Berlin at the Berlin Film Festival, and in Park City, Utah, koshered a restaurant and welcomed people for a Shabbos dinner. Tilda Swinton sat next to me. It was quite an exciting evening for me. And wherever we went, we were demonstrating something interesting, that this was not only about gay and lesbian Jews. This was about a religious tradition that refused to remain unresponsive to a new human realities and to new awarenesses about, in Hebrew, the mitziut, the mitzias. The world was changing, and religious tradition needed not to change itself, but to be responsible to the world in which it is living. And so therefore it brought people together that felt energized by the possibility that the deepest strains of this tradition could be made evocative and alive and responsible now. And I think that is what was the exciting piece of the film, is that it engendered a seriousness on this question that intimated the possibility of almost any question being possible to engage.
Wow, thank you. I have so many questions, but we will come back. I want to move on to Abigail. And you didn't mention this in the bio you sent me, but I will share this with the audience. I conducted interviews over a number of years with Orthodox LGBTQ persons in Israel. And numerous people mentioned you as a visionary foundation of the Orthodox Jewish, Orthodox LGBT community in Israel. And a few lesbian women credit you with like literally saving their lives. So I wanted that to be out there for the audience. Now, the film's rollout in Israel preceded the official founding of religious LGBTQ organizations by a couple of years. And so I'd like to invite you to tell us what your involvement in the film was, where it met you as an early activist in the movement, and whether and how it helped launch the Orthodox LGBT movement in Israel. You're muted.
Okay. I started saying my English is not so good, so I'm sorry about that. So I met Sandy, I think the same time more or less when Steve met him, when he was in Jerusalem looking for characters for his film. And I just finished film school, so I was, do you need any help with work on the film? Nah, I didn't want to take a part as I was just out of closet, and one of the things I told my parents asked me, and I said yes, sure, is don't go public. Wait for when all your siblings are married or something like that. That was the first few years. So, but I got a chance to work with Sandy. I shot some of the scenes in Jerusalem, and it was very interesting for me. And maybe I got more aware of what happens when people stay closeted and get married. And we filmed this I think he was maybe 60 years old, from Mashari, that has like 8 kids, and we had to think how to film him that no one can know who he is, and he tells this very, very, very sad story about his life. Like all his life, he had, I think he had a partner that, and his wife was very miserable, and he never understood why their life is not so happy. So I think it was for me like to get some kind of a perspective of what happens if we stay closeted, if there won't be any change in our community. And then I think Tanya will tell us more about when the film came out and all the educational projects in Israel. But I think it was beginning of the change. You never know what was the beginning or what made the change. There were so many things in this time, and I think when I tell my story in Shoval, when we do these meetings with teachers, so one of the things I said that I think there was this time I thought, you have to live with something that doesn't go together. Yes, I'm lesbian, yes, I'm religious, it will never go together, but I'm old enough to understand this is life. And when I started to understand, maybe we have, I'm saying we because I think all the people here in this panel are part of this change. We have, we came to the world with who we are, and in this generation where this change can happen, if God put us in the world in this time with what we are, me as a lesbian, I guess I have some kind of a role in this world with this specific thing, and I can make a change. We grew up with, my mother was always saying, what we have to do in this world is tikkun olam. And you have to find what's your tikkun olam? It can be in art, and to be literature, to be music, and to be in academia. But we all came here to do a change. So I think that was a moment that, both identities connected to me, because I felt I have something to do with these two identities in this world. And I think I'm sure Rabbi Steve and Tanya will also really saved people's life with this change, because we know that a high percentage of the young people that the reason is the sexual identity, and in religious youth it's even higher. So we know really, for people to know they have a future with a change in life. And I think this is the most important thing for me to have these organizations, is just to know you can have a future. You have, maybe you will have a family, you will have love, you will have kids. Yeah, well, the first thing I thought when I saw Rabbi Steve and Tanya 20 years ago, none of us had kids, and now we all have families and kids. So I think this is a big change that I see in Israel, and I guess in the States. There are many religious gay families. And this 20 years ago, there weren't. I think maybe there were a few, but no one knew that they have a future, and they can have a family, and they can have a happy life. So this is the big change. With all these happy things that we know, it's not, it's still a long way till everyone feels, and as we get more and more people living like this, we get also more people against, and we still have a long fight, I guess. That's what my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. And I have many follow-up questions, but in the next round, after we hear from Tanya. So Tanya, you're here wearing two hats. As a young activist, you manage an educational outreach program that brought the film to many Orthodox communities. But now coming back to this as a social movement scholar, you see this program as an important catalyst in shaping this very movement. And as I said earlier, the panel really emerged out of our conversations about the film's legacies. So first of all, could you tell us a little about what it was like to bring the film into Orthodox communities that until that point really had no language to discuss homosexuality, had no visibility?
So thank you so much. It's been, wait, the other one has to be, we're on the wrong one. Siobhan?
No, Tanya, we can hear you.
Yeah,
And we can
but
see you.
you can see me?
Yes.
Okay, good, wonderful. Sorry, then I can't see myself. So thank you so much for the question. I will try to tell my personal story, my personal involvement, but also try to use different points in this story to sort of reflect based on what I know, what I learned as an activist, and also what I know now as a scholar, sort of what are the strategies. And so I'm thinking about two larger questions. One is this question of historic perspective, right? On one hand, for people who this is their life and this is their story, or activists on this issue, it's always too slow. Change is always too slow. The urgency is great. You know, Abigail talked about the suicide rate. People's lives depend on this, so everything feels too slow. On the other hand, we're 20 years later, and as Abigail said as well, we can't even imagine where we were 20 years ago and where we are now. So there's this sort of historical perspective, like, can we go back to this moment of Trembling as a tipping point or as a moment that was very fundamental in the process. And the other question that I'm really interested in is asking the how question, right? What actually makes change most efficiently? How do we make widespread change? How do we make sustainable change? Like, what can we learn from this Trembling project and the educational work that was done around it that really could become strategic tools for making change in a larger way? So in 1999, I met Steve and other friends here in the late 90s in Jerusalem. I was a teenager. Luckily, they let me hang out with them. And then in 1999, I spent a year living in New York, and I met Sandy as he was finishing the film. And I was I hung out with the crowd of the people making the film, and I went to one of their screenings. And so I was very excited the film was going to come out. I also had a boyfriend at the time. This is 20 years ago, so I can speak about this, who at the end of the year came out. And those two stories didn't seem to be connected. But the reality was that when I came back to Israel in 2000, the fact that the film was about to launch in Israel, but no one really had a good sense of what would it mean to launch this film here, felt very personal to me. It felt personal both because I had been involved and was close to the people who had made the film, but also because I had been in a relationship with a man who was Orthodox and closeted. And then when he came out, I felt like there was this secret that had happened and I'd been hurt. And I imagined all the other women who had not been told and had ended up marrying these men. And so I felt very personally invested in this project. And the way I tell it, maybe Steve wants to tell it differently, but I remember many conversations with Steve and Sandy saying, hey guys, what are you gonna do? You can't just drop the film and expect change to happen in Israel. It's a bombshell. No one will even know how to do anything, work around it. And eventually what we created was this project called Ptach Lev, or the opening of the heart, which was funded as a 1-year long shot to do our best within a year to bring the film to as many people where change could happen around this film, because we knew that at the end of that year, by 2001, the film was going to be in the film festivals and on TV. And so our challenge was to figure out who needs to see this film and how do we get them talking about this issue so that deeper change can happen. And it's not just a niche film shown somewhere and everyone gets upset and resistance, but we actually use this as a moment of change. And I think that we did a few interesting things. First of all, we used the carrot and the stick. We said, hey guys, you really want to talk to us, because if you don't talk to us, the day after everyone watches this film on TV, they're going to come to school, your students, and they're going to all talk to you about this and you won't have any answers. So it's better for you to talk to us than to worry about what are you going to say to your students the day after. And when I say us, we pushed very hard the fact that we were Orthodox, that we knew how to speak the language, that we were able to screen the film within a small, intimate, totally not public, no media conversation. Sometimes I ended up in a living room with 3 rabbis. Sometimes it was within a school or within a yeshiva, but no one else knew about it. It wasn't public in any way. Doing this step by step meant that by the end of the year, we had shown the film to over 2,000 professionals, either therapists and people working with risk at youth, because we assumed that many of those risk at youth, whether Orthodox or traditional in the Israeli sense of Masorti, had this story in the background, but no one knew how to talk about it and identify it, so that the therapists needed to know that this was a real story and they needed to start being able to listen for the signs, or rabbis and social workers or consultants within the school system, within the religious school system. I'll just say this, by the end of the year, we had not only screened to 2,000 people. When I say screen, that means that every one of these people also had at least an hour-and-a-half long conversation, if not a day-long conversation about the film. But we actually had the Ministry of Education itself officially host us in some events and some conferences with this as the title, to the degree that I remember getting a call from one woman who said, Tanya, what have you done to us? Ever since we saw this film, kids keep coming out in all of the schools that I'm in charge of. And I said, yeah, maybe we didn't do anything. Maybe you're just finally listening and opening your eyes. The kids have always been there, but now they know that there's someone to talk to. So I think that within a short year, we did make a big change. So we use this carrot and stick, right? Where insiders talk to us because it's better to talk to us than not to talk at all, because you're going to have to deal with it anyway. We also did an interesting, on one hand, bottom up, right? We went to the gatekeepers, we went to the leaders. On the other hand, we did sorry, that's the top down, but we also did the bottom up. What we did is we brought real stories of real people into the room. And since we could not bring actual people because there was too much risk for people who this was their personal stories, right? What Abigail does now, and all these organizations do now, is they bring actual people who identify as LGBT into the room. We could not physically do that because no one was willing to expose themselves that way. It wasn't safe, but bringing their stories through the documentary film was exactly that kind of powerful witnessing. So that was really bringing it bottom up and saying, let's frame the conversation, not have the big halakhic conversation. I don't care if you think this is good or bad, halachically permissible or not. I just want you to listen and be here with the pain and empathize with these people. These are real people. And we knew secretly, if I'm allowed to say this now, 20 years later, that there was no way of course we would end up having the normative conversation. Right? Of course, we would end up having the conversation about what does this mean about communities? Can these people marry? Can these people have children? Can we, how do we think about halakha differently? But at that moment, what we needed to do was break the initial taboo. And I'll say something else about the taboo, which is that the one story that I think still is most powerful and stays with me is that we had a screening for school principals and heads of yeshivot and like really high-level educators within the Orthodox world. And what I always did right after we screened the film was I asked them to just do one round of just saying how they feel, which is really very touchy-feely for them. It was very hard for them, but we really needed to sort of like hold that moment of the power of watching the film and stay with the emotion before we get all intellectual about it. And one of the rabbis in the group said, well, yeah, that was very sad, and then went on for 20 minutes and explained why halachically this was not okay. And then I turned to the rabbi next to him, and they had been studying together for years, working together for years. And the other rabbi said, I can't say what you just said, meaning I can give that whole speech about why it's halachically impermissible. But the truth is, the film didn't teach me anything new. I've been meeting our students. Every year they come to my door and knock on the door and cry and tell me this story, and I've had to figure out how to be with them. And the shock on the other rabbi's face, meaning it wasn't just a taboo generally, it was actually these two people who had worked together as educators in the same institution. The students knew who they could turn to and who couldn't, but they had never spoken about it. And so I think that what we did in the film, I think I mentioned this already to you once when we talked about this issue, is that all the rabbis who speak out about this now in a more liberal way, I remember where they were 20 years ago and how hard it was for them to talk. But once they started talking, once they realized that they weren't the only ones, that there was a conversation happening, it really freed them and it pushed them. And in a way, I think it also allowed the fact that, I'm a straight woman ally involved in this. And so I had the privilege of being able to push this at that moment where no one else was willing to come forward, but use the stories of the people from the community. And then after a year step away, an amazing activist like Abigail and others then took this forward and I said, this is our story, we can move forward and we can organize and create organizations and move that. And these other rabbis knew that they had a voice and they could talk about this without being censured. I think that really opened up a lot of things that we didn't even imagine were possible. I'll say one more last thing because my time is up, which is that I think that it's also important to understand what is left out of this conversation. So maybe later we can talk about like with all the amazing things that we've done, there's still some things have been left out of this conversation that I think we have to mark, so for the future. So I'll stop here.
Thanks for that, Tanya. And I've heard some of these remarks from Tanya over the years, and part of me thought it's just not fair that other people won't have an opportunity to hear her kind of reflection on this going forward. So I want to come back to our panelists sort of with another sort of round robin, but also feel free to engage each other in this round. And start talking about the legacies of the film. So I teach a course on religion, gender, sexuality, or some combination of these words every year. And I've been screen, well, I may not be able to screen the film in the future if it doesn't come back to the streaming services, but I've had my students engage with it year after year. Students who know nothing about Orthodox Judaism, they're, most of them grew up Catholic, and still 20 years on, the stories are just as moving as they had been 20 years ago. I know that the movie or the film aged well in some contexts in Orthodox circles in Israel in ways that some films really don't. So, but I want to hear from you, sort of how has the film aged? What's the contemporary resonance? And then also maybe refer to what Tanya had kind of reference, sort of the silences and where those come in. So I'll start with you, Steve, and then we'll kind of give everyone an opportunity to talk, but feel free to engage your co-panelists at this point. You're muted.
So thank you. The film, I think, has aged well in some respects, and it feels it feels like our history in others. Like in more Haredi Jewish communities, the film is as alive as it ever was. And while I think social media has changed even those communities, the taboo that Tanya spoke about is still alive and well in many of those communities. Though I will say that in modern Orthodox communities, the film doesn't go, it starts the questions, but it doesn't answer them. And so there's the way I used to see it is that the question needs to be alive in the human context where you meet people who are not letting you turn your head away and not letting you ignore this, people you actually care about. You see as similar to yourself. You can't, cast them away as the other that you do not need to deal with. I mean, the standard frame, if you were gay, was either be silent and stay or speak up and leave. And so the film gave birth to the possibility of staying in the Orthodox community, which is now a much more common affair, while remaining self-affirmingly gay. And that is what's making change. I run an organization, I founded it, and the executive director is a wonderful woman, Miriam Kabakov, and together we've created this organization that it has interviewed 210 Orthodox rabbis across the US and Canada, all Orthodox congregational rabbis, assessing how, in what ways they can open their congregations, because they themselves don't want to be cruel. The empathy, the story of empathy that film gives birth to is alive and well. What is not yet done is, and this is actually exciting to me to share, is that Rabbi Mordechai Vardi of Kibbutz Rosh Surim has created a film that I think of as Trembling 2.0 that asks a different question. What happens when you're 20 years old and the only future you've been given is a straight one? And so even today in Israel and in more traditional environments, the fact that no credible adult life, no life arc is possible for a queer kid growing up anywhere in the religious community. There's very little modeling of what it would look like, and there's very little acceptance of the kind of fullness of a good life that one can offer. And so the question that, that the breaking of the taboo was a great starting point, but it really left unfinished a great deal of work. Among those, the things that can make that happen is a film like Marry Me, However, which challenges rabbis to come up with better things to say than what the two things they now say. They say either remain celibate for a lifetime or marry against your orientation because it'll all work out. And both of those lead to calamitous outcomes. And so rabbis are now aware they have no tools in their toolkit. And it is that awareness over time. It's difficult for them. They resist. You put their feet to the fire and they pull away. But fundamentally, That's the living question. I want to share one story very quickly. I spoke a number of years ago with a rabbi who was the head of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. I said, can I speak with him, about this issue? He said, yes. He was an old friend. We went to yeshiva together. He said, yeah, there are gay people in my shul, but what can I do? My heart goes out to them, Steve, but got to be celibate. What can I do? So I said, can we do a role play? He said, well, okay. I said, my name is Gabe. I'm 16 years old. And I know I'm gay, Rabbi. And I'm terrified. What does God want from me? What would you say? And he said nothing. And I said, well, would you say what you told me? Gabe, you will never be held by someone when you're sad, dance with someone when you are joyous. You will never make love to anybody in your entire life because there's something terribly wrong with you. So he said, I would never say something like that. I put it another way. Well, how would you put it? He said, I don't know. How would you put it? So I said to him, could you say, Gabe, I too don't know why a merciful and loving God makes gay people and gives them an impossible adult life. So no, I don't get it. So you keep 612 mitzvot and you go to Shemaim, you go to heaven in the end of your days with a damn good argument why you live the life you lived. And God is merciful and it'll be all right. And I said, could you say that? And this rabbi, the head of the RCA, said, I could say that. And then I said to him one last thing. I said, could you say one more thing to him? I pushed him further. Could you say, Gabe, I'm 40 years older than you. And so I'll probably be in heaven when you make that argument in front of the Holy Throne. And I want to promise you one thing, that when you make that argument in front of God at the end of your days, why you lived the life you lived, know this, I will be behind you, cheering you on. And the rabbi began to weep. That is where change occurs. When empathy moves to the clear responsibility for the well-being of our kids and our families and our communities, and then halachic possibilities, I think, can emerge.
Wow. Thank you for that. Again, I have so many follow-up questions, but I want to hear from the other panelists. And we had a little bit of a sort of back and forth in the Q&A on whether the film was or was not available. It seems it might be available in some spaces, is not available in others. The film that Rabbi Steve mentioned is by an Israeli rabbi, Mordechai Vardi, which is called in Hebrew, Chatuna Fucha, and in English, Marry Me, However. And I can see why you would call that Trembling 2.0. I was in a screening where he showed just a brief clip of it in a room full of mostly gay, mostly young Israeli men. And it really resonated with their current experiences and continued wrestling. So thank you for mentioning that. Avigail, what's your take on the continued legacies? And I'm really would be intrigued to hear if it shaped and how it shaped the kind of work that Shoval did and sort of the kinds of educational interventions that it maybe made possible.
I think many people in Israel felt this is very American, this film. And many people, they're arguing with, this happens in America. It doesn't happen here. The people don't exist here. So I think one of the important things is really for us as activists is to say, yes, we are here. It's not something that happens only in America. That's what we heard like 20 years ago. But today, I really respect what Rabbi Steve said and what he does, but we are not arguing with rabbis. We're not trying to change rabbis. We say, we are here, we live, we are religious, we are Orthodox, or whatever we choose. And now you have to deal with what you feel towards us. We're here, our kids go to your school, we daven in your shuls, and once I had this Shoval activity with rabbis. And I remember they were talking really also about the halachic things. And I said, friends, the train left the station. We're here, we live as families. We're part of the religious community. You can still argue, but what's exactly wrong with what we're doing and what we're allowed or not allowed to do in our bedrooms, but it's not relevant. For me, and in any place that I talk, I say, I don't ask anyone that's religious, what do you do in your bedroom? Are you counting 7 Nikiim? It's not relevant. Whatever you do, it's between me and God, whatever I do. It's nothing to do with the community. People can live as couples and raise families and be part of the community and be Jewish and religious. And what they do at home is their own private thing, and it's really between them and between God. I think really the film raised the question. I think this is what film should do, not give answers and just bring stories and make people think. That's what I try to do as a filmmaker. So I believe this was the right thing to do, and what I hear from Tanya and from Steve, I think this is what happened really with this film. It was hard for me to believe really it's 20 years, because it feels like really yesterday, but I think really when I talk about film, I many times say about this film, I say this is, for me, it's amazing to see when a film can make a change in the world. Because, you know, I would like to make films that can change the world or change even something small. And this film really made a very big change, I think, in just start the conversation. Because also about the halachic thing, I think that what I know that halakha changed just when people start talking about it. For so many years, this was a taboo, not only in the Jewish community. So when we look at one phrase, "Lo tevashel gdi b'chalev imo," and we see there's hundreds and thousands of books that explain what does it mean and how many hours you wait between milk and meat. And this subject, there are just, you know, the phrases from the Torah, and no one talks about it all these years. So we really don't know, no one knows really what God wants from us. And we know halakha is something to change. We can see it like what I'm sure Tanya can talk about it much better than me, about what the changes that happened with women. It didn't start because rabbis sat and thought, what does God want? Should women take part or not? It started because women wanted to take a part and started to lead things. And it's sad to say, but that's how the world goes. The changes happen from down, and I think in the Orthodox world, or maybe not only, all changes happen from the people, and the leaders came after the change happened. So I think the film is just giving LGBT religious people a voice, and the change comes from hearing their voice.
Thank you. Tanya, same question to you about sort of legacies, and you hinted at silences or omissions.
So this is such a fascinating conversation. It's reminding me of things I haven't thought about in a long time, but also sort of reframing them. So I think I want to say something about the context, and Abigail mentioned this question of sort of feminism or Jewish feminism or Orthodox feminism. I think that is an important context to read this whole move within that. I don't think that that everything we've been talking about tonight could have happened if we hadn't already been deep within the feminist transformation of what Judaism means and what Orthodoxy can mean. And I think that in many ways that is still a promise that hasn't been fulfilled, meaning we are just at the cusp of seeing women become real halachic leaders and rabbis, and I'm just wondering, right? This is an open question, like what kind of stand will they take on these issues, and will they be able to move these issues forward? Because there is such similarity about this idea of like you essentially not belonging, something that you cannot change about yourself is holding you back from being fully part of Avodat Hashem and fully belonging within the community and being involved. And I think that in many ways that position of marginality from which they come, and this extra compassion and listening to other people who are in the margins, and a desire, sort of not even a desire, but a demand that Judaism be more ethical in its norms, and not being okay with saying, well, halakha says we can't, so we'll just move on. I think that we haven't heard yet the end of that conversation, right? We're just seeing how that will affect what Orthodoxy means. And the other issue about context is that I think that Orthodoxy itself has changed so much, and in the US and in Israel in different ways, but it's not the same community either, you know, that it was 20 years ago on many different issues and in many different ways. So I think that as the boundaries become more flexible and become broader and become more sort of overlapping, it's not so clear what being inside and outside means. It's not so clear what Orthodoxy means anymore. It's not so clear who gets to determine what Orthodoxy means, right? Both institutionally and on the ground. I think that all those questions are part of this story as well. And in many ways, this story and the feminist story has pushed Orthodoxy to change from within and to reimagine what it can be, and also is being shaped by that. So I think that's a larger context of the conversation that we need to keep in mind, and that also means that this is a story that it's too early to write with a period at the end. We're not at the end of the story. We're somewhere in the process of this larger change. I think that it is also important to say that this does teach. Steve mentioned this earlier about the idea that the whole community has the responsibility to change this issue, that it is not, I am gay, so therefore I have to fight for my own place, and everyone else can just say, oh, that's very nice. This is the larger community's responsibility to do something about it. And I think that the gay issue is exactly that kind of issue, because people understand that humans live, especially within the Orthodox and Jewish community, they live within communities, they live within families. This is a whole network of people is then affected by one person basically living in a closet or without being able to imagine a future. And so the more, I think about Avigail's mother and the parents of who then became involved and became activists, right? Or my own story, as I said, I was like, a girlfriend of, so like this affects the children of, I can just imagine the ripples and the idea that this is not one person speaking out for themselves, but they're organized, there are groups, they are self-representatives. As Abigail said, they have their own voice, they can't be kicked out of the conversation anymore. And many people in the community feel like this is our larger issue, regardless of whether there happens to be a specifically, LGBTQ identifying person in the room. We have to deal with this as a community, it's our responsibility. And so the last thing that I'll say is about this idea of silence. I'll just, I don't have something to say about this so much as I just want to point it out. I think that most of the conversation we've had tonight and most of the conversation going on so far is not LGBTQ at all. It's LGB, maybe. There's a lot of gender essentialism in Orthodoxy. And in many ways, Jewish feminism hasn't cracked that, right? And I think that as long as you have a mechitza and you have very clear gender segregated educational systems, and in Israel that's just becoming even more obvious and more rampant, it's very, very hard to start really imagining what does it mean to be queer, what does it mean to be trans. That is a whole nother ballgame. And I think that that conversation is very, it's really early. We're not there yet. And I'm sure that Steve and Avigal have more to say about this than I do, but I think that that is really the next big challenge. And that will shake up even some of the ways that the current, the past 20 years have framed a certain kind of conversation. And I think that even what that is based on will have to be questioned, because there are assumptions there that allow everyone to live with what we have now, because it doesn't really ask deep questions about, can we just throw gender out the window, right? And I think that that is a conversation that will be really fascinating and probably very scary for many people to have as we move forward.
Right.
Can I throw something else that I really want to hear from Avigal and Steve on this question, right? The silences are not only around other gender and sexual identities, but of course, it's a very Ashkenazi kind of elite. I've been interviewing activists in this field in Israel over the past few years, and many of them, not everyone, but do come from more elite families and areas. What you're describing is happening in very much the same way in evangelical circles. So the evangelical LGBT movement in the US is very much an LG movement. And so I'm wondering how those silences come in. On the other hand, and Avigal, I hope you can speak to that. I know that Bat Kol recently changed its a vision or mission, right, to include
also the title.
Yeah, so maybe we'll start with Avigal and then
But call it is the issue, and I think there were really the last few years many changes. We have a group of transsexual women. There's this question about transsexual men. Are they still part of Bat Kol or not? But they can choose. I think it's complicated because sometimes being queer is hard in a religious community. That's very separate. But transsexuals sometimes become really like a straight couple sometimes, or a straight man, straight woman, and sometimes you just choose to not to be part of the gay community, and it's even sometimes easier for a community to accept them because it's just a straight person. If that's what they decide. And I know some people in the religious community that became, went through a transition and and they are part of the community, and it's maybe even easier to accept because they're not challenging. So somehow it goes the other way around, but I feel just in Israel, I don't know if it's the same in America, but in Israel, I think what I see in the gay community, the gay religious community, also the gay community, that today transsexuals are really part, and it's a lot. Really, people feel this is part of our community. We have to fight their fights, and in Bat Kol it's very And also in Chavruta, you know, they also see it as a part of their agenda. These are, my son, Ori, that's now 13, told me that, you know, Ima, you think there are like 5 or 6 identities. Really, there are 30-something identities. You really don't know what's going on. So in his class, you know, there's all identities that I never heard about. Makes me feel very old, but I know today really I think young people know we are, there's, you know, the whole scala, and you always can choose another identity. Yeah, I think it's challenging for religious people. Like everything happens in our community 20 years later than the non-religious. So I know like 20 years ago, transsexuals felt they're not part of the gay community and not accepted. And today it's not a question. So maybe we're a little bit late, but in the gay religious community, I think it's not, I think transsexuals, we don't feel out of the fight. You agree, Rabbi Steve?
Well, no, I mean, I think I agree, except that I would say that the challenges, both on a communal level, on an individual level, on a psychodynamic level, on even a halachic level, are not the same. And so the LGBTQ reality is a political reality, and we share a kind of renegade embodiment. But the nature of that embodiment and how it lands on individuals, on families, on communities, on traditions is not the same. And so we run many support groups for parents, but it turned out that the parents who had trans or genderqueer children just didn't feel like the conversation of parents with gay and lesbian children was meeting their needs. So in a way, the political claim gets in the way of the real work. The political claim that we're all together hides the fact that we are incredibly different communities with different needs that nonetheless have faced similar kinds of exclusion and rejection. And so one of the things I would say about this is that, you know, you mentioned it, Abigail, and I think also Tanya, is that Orthodoxy is very gendered. Judaism is gendered. And in fact, there's a reason for it. You know, Pauline ethics is trying to avoid the body. And Greek ethics did largely the same. Jews refuse to abandon the body in their ethical frameworks. The body is meaningful. And so for that reason, one cannot easily ignore it. And so the difference physiologically or in other ways between male and female cisgendered bodies is one that has profound meaning and is morally relevant in a way that, you know, there is no Jew, no Gentile, no man, no woman, no Boer, no Greek, and, you know, in Christ Jesus does not apply to us. We somehow want to, we want to make distinctions between things and including male and female. Chana Pinchasi, when my book came out in Hebrew, said one thing on a panel in Israel that I remember today. She said, Steve, the difference between these things, between men and women, between gay and straight, between, you know, a whole array of things, we've not abandoned the difference. We just need to get rid of the tripwire. I think that's a very traditional attempt to sustain gender, but get over the fact that in between there will be liminal frames. And it's true for Jew and Gentile. Well, there was Ger Toshav, which was Jew and not Jew. That, you know, and there was androgynous, which was male and female and both a little bit and neither, right? So it may be that part of the challenge now is to actually engage with these new realities as a way of not jumping on the bandwagon of every, let me just say that I struggle with this myself. The schools that come to us now are coming to us less and less about kids coming out as gay or lesbian, and more about kids coming out as trans or genderqueer. And almost as if it's a form of adolescent rebellion or adolescent, identity formation to challenge the notions of gender and sexuality that we were born with. And so I guess the deepest question we have to ask is, how can religions help us to make new sense of what it means to be a man and a woman that are nonetheless reflective of the ways in which people actually live in many places and still value how their body conveys meaning to them socially and otherwise, but leave room for all kinds of new formulations, as you say, of Yigael in 30 different colors. And I don't know, religion may be a resource in this discussion that we're not admitting. And sometimes I think that we have these conversations and it's as if religion needs to be schooled by LGBT activists. And I think that's true, but LGBT activists need to be schooled by religion too, because the conversation cannot happen unless all the human realities, those expressed in religion and tradition, those expressed in family and community, and those expressed in the individual lives of unique and wonderful people all come to the table together. And it's hopeful to me that, there was one trans person in Sandy's film. I think he wanted to kind of put one little grain of recognition in the film in order to leave a space for that unfinished work.
Can I jump in with one quick thing? Wait. So
Yeah.
just on this idea that I think that Steve, I think it's very powerful to think about how religion is a resource here, and how basically by insisting on staying within the community and saying, as Abigail said earlier, we're here, we're staying, now let's figure it out, right? I think that in a way, this is an example of people within the community who are on the margins of the community and theoretically from this liberal secular viewpoint could have freed themselves and just let go. Like, why are you sticking to this repressive religion, right? Just move away. Why do you have to be an Orthodox feminist? Just become a Reform feminist, etc. We hear that all the time, but by saying we are staying within, it's not just because we want to make our life difficult, it's because there really is something very powerful in this religious life, in the sense of community and belonging, in the connection to God, in what this means educationally for the children that we want to raise and how we want to raise them. And I think in a way, this is, instead of viewing communities sort of from the margins as people who are troubling, they are actually in many ways fortifying and reviving and revitalizing what Judaism and what Orthodoxy means, right? They're bringing back this voice of saying, I care about God in my life. I care about mitzvot in my life. I care about being part of this community. I'm going to fight for this. I don't know how. It's going to be painful. I'm going to make it work. And in a way, and again, I'm drawing also the connections here to Orthodox women insisting on becoming a rabbi at a time that rabbis are less important in Jewish life, right? So right. There's this idea that there is real power here, sociologically, emotionally, spiritually, that is being sustained dafka by the people who were theoretically supposed to not find a home there. And I think that in a way, that's also part of this larger story, and something that can be learned from them. And I think that in the Israeli context, that also really does a really good job at pushing against these boundaries of religious and secular, and who is liberal and egalitarian and who isn't. Right? It shows exactly how homophobic secular liberal society is in Israel. And it also shows how powerful religion can be as a force within people's lives without it necessarily being fundamentalist and conservative and anti many other minorities.
Right. Just to jump on to Tanya, just one more little note, and that is it's exactly that, is that I tell young queer Jews is that, don't stay Orthodox because your parents want you to stay Orthodox. Stay Orthodox because your queerness is going to save it. your queerness is going to revive its significance because you will make it appear responsible and engaged with the human condition in the deepest ways, and people are going to respect and love it more. You're going to save it from being irrelevant and from being kind of a religion of, kind of cisgendered men and the women who are, kind of subservient to them. If that orthodoxy you want to survive, fine, then leave. But if you want orthodoxy to be this rich engagement that continues to evolve slowly, but nonetheless inexorably, then stay. And I think that's the excitement of this community, and it's what gave birth to the film.
Wow, that actually answered. So we had some questions in the chat precisely on this question. Why do people stay, right? Why don't they leave? Why don't they go? Avigai, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Why do we stay?
Yeah.
I think I'm almost sure every gay religious person had this thought: should I leave? Do I want to be a part of a community that doesn't accept me? And I think for many of us, first of all, it's home. It's what we want, what we grew up. But I think the feeling that we're part of a change and changing, and maybe this is the reason we came to the world as gay people, is to make this change, and it's our responsibility for our brothers and sisters and all what's between brothers and sisters. So I think really this is our responsibility for the community, and I really believe it's when we're helping the community to accept us. It's not only us, it's maybe I'll talk about the Israeli Orthodox community. The challenge of this community is to learn to accept the other. And it's not only gays, it's non-Jews, maybe people with disabilities. I think our community became very unaccepting others. And I feel we are just maybe 10%, but if this community will learn to accept us, it will learn to accept others. And I think for me, this is our responsibility to make a change. And I believe making the religious Jewish community closer to what it's supposed to be and what Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted it to be. And it's maybe very simple to say, but ואהבת לרעך כמוך should become again the most centered thing in Jewish life.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say, you said something about Ashkenazim, but I disagree. I mean, maybe the people you met, but it's a whole different, maybe a whole different discussion. But there's many Masortim gays that are accepted in their families, and it's really not a privilege of, this, maybe the people you see in this panel, but I really don't think what I see around me, it's not only Ashkenazi story. Really, really I see it in the organizations, and maybe in the Ashkenazi community, people, it's more you have to decide, are you religious or are you not religious? And in Mizrahi families, you can be sometimes this, sometimes that. The family can accept you sometimes with a kippah and sometimes without, but you're still part of the family, and that's what I see around. Really, I think it's another discussion.
That is a whole other panel, and I'm watching the time, and we're gonna have to wrap up shortly. So can I invite each of you kind of to not give us any prophecy about the future, because we know who makes prophecies, but some closing remarks, this sort of looking back. We're not right. This is still a movement in the making, but any future looking closing remarks. So let's just start with Steve again. And
well, the positive nature of this discourse and our excitement about how much change has happened is really, I'm an optimist by nature. But the truth is that there's a great deal of backlash also happening just now. In the Yeshiva University world, there is a very strong resistance to addressing these questions. Despite the fact that, when we get together parents, we had we have been gathering parents in before COVID and then, online afterwards. And 95% of these parents want their kids to be married to same-sex people, to find happiness in adult happiness in the way they need to. But their rabbis are not there yet at all. So I guess the future is to figure out what Abigail suggested, which is how we basically create the grassroots movement of alliances, of the educators that just say, we're just gonna start figuring out how, a case came to me yesterday. What do we do with a genderqueer child who wants to stay in the school and doesn't want to daven in either the male or female sides of the mechitza? And what role can be had for the pragmatist principle that wants to make it work, and that wants the name change to be effectuated, and that wants the bullying to stop? That person who, even though the rabbi who is the posek of the school is making the formal rules, the more pragmatic voices, and I think this has been said by all of us, are really beginning to change the way the cookie crumbles. And all these children are watching, all the young kids in the school are watching what the school does. They're all talking about it. Whether, this person who was once named Avigail and is now named Asher is allowed to do X or Y or Z. Can they wear pants? So what's occurring now is exciting, but I don't think we're finished in any way, shape, or form. And we still, the work needs to still be done in the trenches. And I'm glad that there are people like Avigail and intellectual leaders like my dear friend Tanya at Zion-Waldoks, and many, many others who are just carrying this story forward into its next iterations.
Abigail?
Wow, I don't have a lot to add. Thanks, Rabbi Steve. I personally, I feel like the next generation should do the fight. We started, no, the younger people should do the next step, and I think they are doing it. I'm really happy you put this panel because it reminded me how much happened in 20 years and how I maybe 20 years ago couldn't imagine this would be my future. And I believe the younger people that are 20 years younger than me can imagine a future, and you can't imagine what will be in 20 years.
Thank you. And I guess, Tanya, you get the last word, which is fitting because this was really your idea. So with the two hats, where do you see this? Where do you see this going?
So from my activist hat, I'm really with Abigail, and Steve mentioned this earlier too. I think it's very important to celebrate. We're very good at like looking ahead and saying what haven't we achieved yet? But I think it's really important to stop and celebrate what we have achieved and sort of gain a little bit of perspective and motivation. And from my sort of scholar hat or my critical thinking hat, I think it's very, very important to remember this is not a linear process, not just because of the backlash that Steve talked about, which is certainly true and in Israel is very much felt, but because there are many different communities that we're talking about, and there's a lot of difference between these. And so we have to sort of hold patience for communities who are still right now doing where we were 20 years ago. And I think that sometimes part of the more liberal conversations about these things loses patience with anyone who isn't quite as woke as they are. And I think we really need to find a way to work with multiple rhythms that are happening at once and not expect everyone to standardize because we'll just lose. And also I find a lot of hope in kids, right? So like, I think a lot about my children who grew up in a partnership minyan and have friends like Amalia, Steve and Steve's daughter, and have friends who are genderqueer and have they don't even think twice when their friend is now a he and not a she. And even if that friend hasn't figured it out yet, this is how they're going now. So that's how we're going to treat this human being now. And there's no real difference. So like, I really think that the taken for granted, the muvan me'elav, sometimes can change within one generation in incredible ways. And then the conversation starts at a whole new place. And yet we still also have to be patient with the fact that some people and some communities are just opening up in this conversation. We have to be patient with the time it takes for them as well to figure out how they want to deal with these issues.
Thank you. Okay, so patience. So celebrate.
Well, urgency and patience.
And patience. Okay, well, if we were all live, this would be a moment of celebration and clapping. I don't know if you'll be able to see the audience if they clap with using their emojis. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I know it's getting later in Israel. And
Can I end with a quick story from Trembling?
Please.
So we showed the film in Berlin, in the Berlin Film Festival. And there was an all Jewish guy in the corner trying to ask a question in the Q&A, and this German guy wouldn't answer him. Finally, I kept pointing and he did, and he gets up and he says, I'm a Holocaust survivor, but I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about going to shul with my father in Poland before the war. And on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there was a row of men in the back row who without talis were crying the whole time. And I asked my father, who were those men? And my father said, they're the Rishoyim, they're the wicked ones. And he turned to the audience, he said, these men, I now know, they were gay. He said, and this is a very, very beautiful film because we are all God's children. And for the first time, I had this picture, not only of what this film means today, what Trembling means today, but what it challenges us to think about in regard to all the spaces in which people struggled in communities of all kinds with this self-understanding that had no language at all. And how incredibly just blessed we all are that we can be part of communities that now have language, that have artful resources to bring these stories into view, and then can take it across the world so that I can listen to a Holocaust survivor share with me a story of his growing up in Poland and his discovery anyway, that the men he saw in the back row, he now realizes exactly who they were. Thank you for making this happen. This is just an incredible opportunity for us to think through the joyous power of what has happened, and a real sense of just celebration of how all we've been part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and continue doing the good work. Carry it forward. Bye. Thank you.